Welcome back to Scaling Theory. My guest today is Albert-Laszlo Barabási, professor of network science at Northeastern University and one of the most cited scientists in the world with over 320,000 citations. His book includes Linked, The Formula, and Network Science. In 1999, Albert-Laszlo published a paper that changed how we understand networks. The finding was this: real-world networks are not random. They are dominated by hubs. A few nodes collect most of the links, and they do so precisely because they already have them. In this episode, Albert-Laszlo explains the details of what he actually found. We then move on to the scaling of networks and the temptation to control them. We conclude with a discussion about art, ballet dancers, architecture, and what mapping careers across disciplines reveals about how networks really work. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. First of all, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast. As we just discussed before starting the recording, I had a great pleasure of spending a couple days, a couple weeks, getting deep into your papers and books. And I came up with a huge list of questions. I think by far the largest I ever created before an interview. So maybe one day we'll have to record part 2, but I'm going to try my best to focus most of the discussion on what I think is central to the theme of the podcast, which is, again, scaling theory. What I've done is that I've divided the questions in 3 parts. First, I want to talk about some initial discoveries that you've made. I'm sure you've been asked a million times, but we have to start there, and I'll make it short and concise. Then I want to talk about scaling, and in a sense, how you control that, or the temptation to forecast and maybe control the complexity of networks and how they evolve. And then in part 3, I want to do something that I've never done on a podcast, which is to talk about art. And listeners, get ready for something pretty unique because there is a lot for you to say on the subject. All right. That being said, starting with the initial discoveries, and here this will bring us back to 1999, you are credited for discovering scale-free networks and proposing the Barabasi-Albert model. In a nutshell, and please correct me if my understanding is wrong, but what you show is that real-world networks, such as web to biological and social systems, don't have a typical average structure, but are instead dominated by a few highly connected hubs. And those hubs emerge through a reach-get-reacher dynamic known as preferential attachment. And I will come back to it eventually. But so to get us started, when you look back on what you published now almost 30 years ago, which claim do you think was the deepest in the paper, and which claim has been the most misunderstood?
Well, first of all, let's clarify the year. So everybody kind of looks at it that my interest in network science began in 99 because that's when I successfully published a paper that everyone noticed. But I think it's just as instructive of looking at where it really started. And that was 1994 when I was a postdoc in New York at IBM. And it was there that partly in the computer science literature, partly being inspired by Manhattan where I lived and I kind of perceived the many networks that hold it together, that I started to think about networks. And I'd even written 2 papers. One of them got published and the other one didn't. And never did not because I didn't try, and I tried many journals, but everybody told me, who the hell cares about networks? What are you talking? So now looking back, you say, oh my goodness, what we did in 30 years ago was such a, is in a way transformative and in hindsight obvious, right? But it wasn't at all obvious at that time that networks are of interest for the scientific community and required quite a bit of convincing. In our case, it took 4 years to get the first meaningful paper published. And that was indeed the scale-free paper in 1999. Actually, there were 2 papers. There was one in Nature in 99 that we reported that the World Wide Web has this power law degree distribution, or it's a scale-free network. And then a few months later, we had the Science paper that we offered the mechanism for it. Why was that important? And coming back to your question of what was obvious and what was not. Preceding this work, whether you look at the work of sociologists, whether you look at the work of biologists, whether you look at the work of mathematicians, they all inherently assume that the networks are random. Whether they stated it like that, that's a different story, but fundamentally everything they did can be reduced to what we call today the Erdős and Rényi model of networks, which assumes that nodes are just randomly connected to each other. And that makes a very precise prediction that despite the randomness of how we choose our friends, we are all equal or similar, because the randomness is not big enough to create major differences between us. In the technical language, if we look at how many friends you have and I have, and everybody around us would follow a Poisson, a very narrow Poisson distribution, meaning would be all alike. So in the context of this was the discovery surprising that we made in 1999 by first looking at the World Wide Web, and then looking at a couple of other real networks like citation networks and collaboration network between actors and so on, where we found that not only that the Poisson is not a good fit, but there's another fundamental law that is a power law, which is telling us really that instead of all of us being very similar to each other, there are giant differences among us. Most people have relatively few links, doesn't matter what network they're participating in, and a few nodes have an exceptionally large number of links that we call hubs, right? So what has been, you are asking what is the things that I think that was most misunderstood at that moment. And I think the most misunderstood aspect of was really that what you refer to as the Barabasi-Albert model, which is the mechanism of growth and preferential attachment. And we proposed the model that is called today the Barabasi-Albert model based on me. And of course, let's be clear, Albert is my student Reka Albert. So it's not both of my names. It's often misunderstood. And the most misunderstood aspects was that people think that the Barabasi model, Albert model, is a model, say, of the internet, of the World Wide Web, or the cell. That is a model of something. And it was never intended to be such. It was a mechanism. We were just trying to show that these two mechanisms, which is the fact that networks grow, they are not static objects, and the fact that there is what we call what we name preferential attachment, namely that highly connected nodes collect more links than less connected nodes, and that's a linear relationship. The more links you have, the more links you will gain. That is, the more friends you have, the higher likelihood you would make new friends. So these two laws, that is growth and preferential attachment, are sufficient to explain this huge heterogeneity of the networks. That is the existence of the hubs and the many, many small nodes. But it was never intended to be a model of the cell, nor of the internet, nor of the World Wide Web. And why wasn't that sufficient? Because the cell, the social networks and the internet have lots of other things going on in them. So if you want to model them, you have to incorporate many other things as well. But if they are scale-free, and they are, we know that empirically, whatever model you build will have to have these two ingredients, growth and preferential attachment.
Let me ask a question, which is maybe a side question. But so you've mentioned that one of the two papers you never managed to publish, and yet you score Nature and Science, the two leading publications.
Yeah.
Is there a logical explanation behind that?
It's a good question. As I said, I've been working since 1994 on networks, and I think Reka Albert came into the picture around 97 or 98. I should check up actually on my notes on that, probably 97. She was a student of mine, and she was working on something else. And I remember at a certain moment, I invited her out to lunch, and I said, listen, during your PhD, you've done so much the things that you are technically done, but I know you have to stay a little bit in the program for personal reasons. So let's do this thing. I have this interest, I'm very interested in this network problem, but no one seems to be caring about it. And let me show you indeed that the paper that I was the most interested about, I could never publish it. It's out there on the archive, but everywhere it was rejected. But I think it's a very, very, very interesting problem. And we may not get high-profile publications. She and I already had a Nature paper before and a couple of other higher-level publications, but I think it's worth the investment. So she said very kindly, yes, let's do it, right? And I was right on everything except on the impact of the papers, right? So the 5 papers that we published, she and I, after that, were all Nature and Science. So what happened? And that's your question, right? There are a number of things happened. First, I think we learned to articulate better the problem, right? So I want to be very honest with myself and the word is that I don't think in 94 and 95 I knew how to articulate why networks are important, right? So that's number one. So that's a communication issue that we all scientists have to learn. Second, there was an increasing awareness of these 5 years because that was a time when the World Wide Web has really started to make an impact in everybody's life. So people started to think about networks. And finally, the key issue was I wasn't just modeling, I had empirical data. Right. So we had actually something to tag on to that. So we're not just saying networks are important, but here is a very fundamental property of networks that was not recognized before, and I had data to show it. So I think these 3 things actually came together, right? The better ability to articulate the reason for exploring networks, a bigger awareness of networks, and the emergence of data has really allowed us that once we really got seriously started again on the problem, we were making discovery after discovery that was worthy of Nature and Science.
Yeah. Something else you mentioned is that so you started with the web, and of course at the time this was all the fuzz I can imagine. So in a sense you were well positioned, but then eventually you end up finding that there is this power law everywhere. When is it that you realize that wait a minute, this might actually be way bigger than what we first envisioned?
It's a good question. So the fact that the next 2 evidences, well, very good question. So the first realization that I had was I was in Porto, Portugal at a conference. And before I left, Reika and I have agreed that she will analyze a couple of other data sets. So one of them is the actor data that Steve Strogatz and Duncan Watts just published like a few months earlier. And the other one was we got access to some kind of computer chip data. And so while I was in Porto, I remember I got an email from her saying, you know what, I just analyzed this data and they also seem to be following power law. And at the same time, somebody just put out a preprint at the conference on the table because people at that time would share the printed versions of their papers, right? So there was a table where everybody could put out their preprints and somebody just put out a paper. Actually, it was Sid Radner from Boston University, the place where I got my PhD. But by that time, I wasn't there any longer. That he showed that citation networks follow a power law. He didn't say anything about networks, just the distribution. And so suddenly I was at that conference and I had these 3 extra data points, right? The 2 that Reika sent me over, plus the one that Redner put out, and our World Wide Web data, and it just hit me that there's no way that these systems independently develop a power law, right? The computer chip, the World Wide Web, the citations, and the actors. And if such a different systems all behave alike, there has to be a very simple and very fundamental explanation that applies to all of them. And I remember at that moment, I got up from the conference and I went back to my room, which was in a seminary. And I just sat down and I said, I have to figure this out. And I did at that.
Yeah. It's very often what I experience in conferences, which is that I would say the number one value of it is hearing something and plugging that idea into your network of ideas and concepts and figuring it out or experiencing what it means for what you have pre-thought already. So it seems that this is very much what happened to you in that case. Let me now move on to part 2 of the conversation, in which I want to talk about scaling and the desire to control it, which is very human, I suppose.
Yes.
So in that model, you indeed came up with an explanation about preferential attachments, which is one of the most influential ideas today in network science. But at the time, it wasn't so obvious. So if you were to be in the shoes of someone who haven't yet heard about it, so someone who's not into complexity, network, and all that, what would you insist they understand about preferential attachments?
Well, I mean, I think I would insist on understanding that heterogeneity, which is the result of preferential attachment, is an inherent property of the society and where no one is average, right? So we're all different and substantially so. And of course, if you look at the height, we're not so different, right? The human height is kind of a Gaussian distribution for adults, right? But when it comes to behavioral aspects, however, we are hugely heterogeneous. And then you would ask, where does that come from, right? Why are we so different, despite that you could say biologically we're very, very kind of constrained and similar? And that comes from the fact that fundamentally much of who we are is determined by relationships. We're embedded in these type of networks, right? And these networks are not random networks, but they emerge through growth, right? When you're born, you're only two people, your parents, and you may not even know them, right? But as you grow, you're acquiring your links by meeting more and more people. And all networks that we look at it actually are fundamentally such a growing objects. And so on one end, you have to acknowledge that networks are never static, but they're always in flux. And we as a node are always in flux. So gaining new links and losing links, number one. And second, and this is the key, and that's where it comes to preferential attachment. The way we choose links is not fair, right? But we connect to things that we know. But what we know tends to be the most connected nodes, right? Because those are easier to find, right? If somebody has no friends, no one will introduce me to him or. If somebody has lots of friends, the likelihood that I will get introduced to that person is very, very high because there's a chance we have common friends. So the processes that determine our ability to acquire links, to acquire money, to acquire knowledge, to acquire lots of different things, social kind of position, things like that, are all determined by these networks. And the networks are driven by what we call preferential attachment. That is, the more you have, the more access you get. And by the way, this is not new in the sense that the so-called Pareto law already spoke about it in the context of economics, right, in 1800, of why there's such a huge income differences. What was new in this context is that we brought it to networks, right? So like we said, this is fundamentally a structural feature, and it affects the structures in which we're embedded in. And and then once you kind of acknowledge that is there, then we can quantitatively describe what happens in real systems. And the reason it became of such a major value is because it was about the same time that people were starting to pull out from their closets all these data that characterize different type of networks. And fundamentally, people started to realize we have these very, very common features.
In another model, Bianconi-Barabasi model, you introduced fitness into preferential attachment. So in a sense, it's not just so that the rich get richer, but also intrinsic quality can actually define how a node will scale. So could you deep dive into what's the relationship between the growth of the network and fitness, how this all interacts?
Obviously. So, soon after we had this model, we recognized that the likelihood for you to collect links is not only driven by how many links you have, but also by innate properties, right? And we know there are people who are super social and they can make friends no matter where they are, and others are much more withdrawn. But the same is true actually in most other networks as well. Like some websites are interesting, and once you go there, you want to go back again and again, offer services that you need, and others you go once and you forgot it before you click away, right? So there are these innate differences in the nodes, and we wanted to capture that mathematically, as well as to kind of predict some features of networks that we couldn't explain with the Barabasi-Albert model, because again, I was emphasizing Barabasi-Albert model is not a model of anything. It's a mechanism. So then we realized there's a simple way that we borrowed really from ecology, which is just to say nodes have fitness, and fitness is your ability to acquire links. That is, preferential attachment is not just proportion of how many links you have, but is fitness times the number of links you have. Why do you need both? Because the number of links you have tells you how easy you are to find. The fitness tells you, once I met you, do I want to talk to you again? Right? So fundamentally, both of them are contributing to the rate that you will actually acquire links. And then once we put that one in, then we were able to explain a much richer kind of features of networks. And of course, then what happened later is that once we became smart enough and then we could measure preferential attachment, and this is key, right? People tend to think, oh, a preferential attachment is a hypothesis. Yeah, it was a hypothesis, a mathematical hypothesis that we needed to get things work. But then 2 or 3 years later, we and others have figured out that if you give us a network, particularly a dynamically evolving network, which we have a lot, right? We can see, we can measure and falsify the question, is there or there is no preferential attachment there? Are there fitness differences or there are no fitness differences? And the data indicated not only that in all these systems where you have hubs that there is preferential attachment, that was very clear, right? But in many systems, we're able to even measure the node fitnesses, right? So like indeed, there are big variations in node fitnesses. One of my favorite is actually a work we've done in case of scientific publications, right? And the fitness of the publication is really kind of determines is how many citations it gets ultimately, right? That is the determining factor. And what is the fitness of a publication? Is this inner quality that tells you that once you actually read it, will you actually cite it? Will you build something on that? And that becomes measurable, not by reading the paper and saying, oh, this is a high fitness one, but by seeing how others have reacted, how the citations are accumulating on that. That allows me to really quantify what is the fitness and explain and ultimately how many citations will it ever get through its lifetime.
Yeah, that must be very convenient knowing that you are a scientist and are publishing quite a few papers. Now that you've published this research quite a few years ago, if you take a step back, do you find those dynamics in all networks? Are there networks in which you actually found that, well, maybe it doesn't work that well, or maybe I need to do some more research? What's your current state of mind on the subject?
So even at the outset, it was very clear that there are lots of networks for which this theory was not intended to describe. So listen, I came from materials science to this problem, right? We have a giant number of networks in materials. If you think about the crystalline lattices, those are all networks. From our purposes, they're very boring networks from a network science perspective, because how many links a carbon atom can form is purely determined by quantum mechanics. It has 4 electrons to share. It can have 4 bonds. So no miracle will happen. You can have an ordered lattice. You can have a crystalline lattice. You can have a hexagonal lattice. You can have a diamond lattice. But fundamentally, the number of links an atom will have will be 4 or less. And there will be no exception to that rule. So there's lots of networks out there that are inherently static networks, and you don't need network science to describe them. We had to begin with very good tools. What network science became necessary for is because we started to become interested in self-organized system, right? Internet, World Wide Web, social system, economic systems, things that are not ruled by these strict quantum mechanical rules, but we have freedom at the node level where to connect and how to connect. And in those systems, however, these theories are essential. You cannot understand these systems without them.
Let's talk now about control, or at least the willingness to influence those. So in a work that you co-authored with Liu Slotin, I hope I pronounced that okay, you show that influencing a surprisingly small set of driver nodes can actually steer an entire network in a desired direction. Now, you've done a lot of work in medicine. Unfortunately, we cannot cover that because I will pretend this is a lack of time. This is really a lack of knowledge on my part. But to steer you towards what I know best, which is the law and regulation, is there any implication for regulatory design? So I guess another way to put it is, should enforcers focus on a few of those nodes rather than to try to rule them all at the same time?
I would say they already do, but let's just step back and say what control theory is really in the context of networks and why does it matter, right? So, network science mostly focused on the structure of the network, but really networks are there for a purpose, right? cellular network is there to kind of continue and produce life. The brain network is there for produce intelligence and so on and so forth, right? So every network that we have out there in the nature have a particular purpose. Purpose often means that there is not only the network, but there's some dynamical process going on the network, right? There's information transfer, material transfer in the cell, for example, chemical transfer, and so on. So networks are inherently dynamical systems. So if we look only at the structure, we're not really understanding what they're really for. We need to look at the dynamics as well. So control really comes in the context of looking at the full system, at the structure and the dynamics. And the question what we ask in control that comes really from engineering as well as applied mathematics, the so-called control theory, is if you have some kind of dynamical process going on in the system, how would you be able to control what the system does? And of course, the obvious way to control a system is to say, I'm going to control every single node, but that's too costly. So the question is, could you just control a few? Let me give an example where that works. A car, right? A gas-based car has about 6,000 components. Yet when you drive, you are not aware of the 6,000 components, right? You're aware of the steering wheel, the gas pedal, and the brake, and maybe a clutch if you have a non-automatic car, right? And by changing the state of these 4 variables, you can make the car go anywhere where the car goes. That is, you have full control over the 6,000 components that make up the car, right? And so in that sense, you would say that the car is controllable from these 4 inputs, and I would urge you not to buy a car that doesn't have that property. Right? So the question would be that if I'm given a complex system, be a cell, be an organization or so on, right? How do you find those points from which you can control, right? Can you even find that? Number one, are there such a points? How many there are? And so the theory that we developed in that Nature paper that you're referring to is that we showed that indeed in any network-based complex systems, and all complex systems are network-based, you can look at the structure of the network and you can define what we call control nodes, or identify, not define, you have to identify. Those are already in the system. And the control nodes have the property that if you now have input through the control nodes, like pushing the gas pedal, you are able to control all the other nodes. And so we actually provided a recipe that you, having an arbitrary network, how do you find those control points? And then, of course, the secondary question, which we didn't address, but that's a major question being worked on in control theory, is that how should your signal look like for you to be able to control the rest of the nodes? So in that sense, when it comes to policy and design of networks, there are many, many implications, right? Because when you have build policy, you are inherently constraining the networks, right? That's what social media companies do when they actually build certain feature into the system, whether it's Facebook or Instagram, and they all have different features. They are constraining what kind of networks can emerge. And then once that network has emerged, that has features that are dictated by the network structure. So fundamentally, the only control you have about a self-organized system is what rules you put in place of where the connections can be, right? Like, do you allow likes? Do you like friendship links? Does it has to be reciprocal or only one way or just following, right? All of these look like funny little decisions, but they're fundamentally shaping the network in which you end up building with that, because once you put the rules in place, then we all come and we play according to those rules because we have no choice, right? And then as a result, some network will show up, right? The Facebook network, the Instagram network, the Twitter network. And those are very, very different from each other. And why? Because they have different rules and policies in place. So yes, you have lots of control. And actually for policymakers, one of the biggest role they have in the system is always to dictate what is possible and what is not. And the responsibility is huge because once you release those rules, that will shape the full structure of the system.
There is a very nice connection with one of our past episodes. I had a conversation with Larry Lessig from Harvard Law. And Larry Lessig has this framework about the 4 constraints that also applies online. So you have the law, economic norms, and architecture, which is how things are designed. And we talked about how changing those constraints or trying to combine them may actually be a nice way to try to control a network. And what you are saying is that, well, actually controlling some of the key hubs may do the trick. And so the very interesting question will become which of those hubs are more susceptible to be changed by which of those constraints.
It was interesting. One of the biggest conclusion of the story was that it's not the hubs that you need to control, because the hubs typically are already controlled by other nodes because they have so many incoming nodes that somebody else already controls the hub or multiple links, right? So
Mm.
often the control nodes in many control problems are not the hubs, but nodes positioned in such a way that information starts with them and they don't get controlled by anybody else. Because if you are a node that you don't get any input, I must control you. Otherwise, you're going to do whatever you want, right? And then so it typically starts the control from nodes that take no orders from anyone else.
Yeah. But so that stays a micro policy, right? Because in my mind, hubs were actually nodes in the network with other hubs. But you are saying that, well, actually, no, it really works at the micro level.
Well, I mean, just think of that way, right? If somebody is already getting inputs and the hubs already get lots of input, then they're already controlled to some degree by that input. So if you design the right control strategy, I can get control over them, right? And what I don't have control over the people who are not hubs and they don't get input from anyone else.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Let's push that a bit further. So, if you want to control a network to the point of, let's say, destroying the network, which might be relevant in medicine, if that's a network that is creating or causing cancer, or to go back to social media, let's say you identified that this is creating a huge problem with teens and therefore you may want to do something about it. What you show in your work on error and attack tolerance is that scale-free networks are robust to random failure, which is often what we want, right? We often talk about how to make a network more robust, but also they are fragile to targeted attacks on hubs, which might actually be a feature if you are trying to disable the network. So is there something to learn from that when it comes to, let's say, trying to regulate the big tech companies, or maybe we could take social network as an example?
I mean, certainly, and to some degree, this is intuitively built into the system. So the biggest hub of the internet is the AT&T's big facility actually near Chicago, and that's almost a military installation. It's so well defended, right? So in a way, the way I think about it is that you're absolutely right. One of the big discoveries we made in 2000 is this kind of Achilles heel property, meaning that networks are very, very robust to random failures. That is, if the nodes really break down randomly, the network can sustain its ability to function, almost not noticing it, right? If your secretary is out for the day, the department doesn't fall apart. Yes, right. We can manage, right? But however, if the hubs are missing, and particularly not one, but multiple hubs are simultaneously moved, then the network is very vulnerable and can fall apart precisely because there's so much relying on the hubs to hold it together. So on one end, I think that structural inhomogeneity and its consequences need to be recognized, particularly in systems that rely on the hubs, like the internet, right? And the cell. And as you kind of pointed to it, sometimes it's a bug and sometimes it's a feature. In the case of the internet, it's a problem because attacking a couple of major hubs could really take it down. And there were actually early on, when the system was not so well protected, there were successful attempts in that way. Lately, the system is so distributed that it's a little harder, but I always think about it as that people who could really take down the internet have no interest to do so because their playground will be gone to do other malices, right? So it's a vehicle to do other things, not to get rid of it, number one. But as you said, in some cases, like in case when if you want to kind of attack bacteria, then it's a feature because you could design drugs that go after the hubs. Now, it's never as easy as it looks. And I can tell you why. Because evolutionary hubs are very preserved. That is that bad bacteria and good bacteria have the same hubs. So you have to be a little bit more sophisticated to take out that bacteria, because if you just go for the main one, you're going to kill all the bacteria of it. And in general, not only the bacteria, but you may be actually killing the human. So But that's where the network comes in, right? So it's not just simply black and white. You need to have a full understanding of the structure of the network to intervene in an effective way. And if anything we learned in the last 30 years from network science is that you have to be able to map out your networks if you want to do something with them, right? So it's not a PowerPoint based decision making, right? It has to be a data based decision making where you really understand and map out your system, understand its properties. And if you got that far that you can map out your system and you understand how it works, then you got the tools of network science to design interventions that work.
Yeah, so I wanted to, again, annoy you with the very last question on regulation, but you actually kind of answer it. I wanted to ask what network literate regulator would do differently. But so you are saying, well, maybe no PowerPoints, instead, map the network and have a database. So let me ask a different question. I know you've done some work on AI. And at some point, we're going to have to talk about it, right? So let's do it now. Is there a use of AI to try to better understand networks? Is it something you are doing? And is it something that policymakers should do?
Yes, of course. I mean, first of all, AI is a tool that no one can avoid these days, right? And so as a tool to achieve things, to gather information, to analyze data, and so on. But also AI itself is a network, right? And it does work as a network. So one of the big questions for network science is that what are the network features that really make it possible? And even more philosophical questions, how is it different from the other network that is intelligent, which is our brain, right? And so on. So I think there are lots of questions where network science is really already involved deeply into the whole AI space and will continue to do so, particularly when we get out of the engineering space and we're going to start developing some more fundamental theories of AI. We're not there yet because right now the AI community is just too busy making things work. But there will be a moment of reflection where we'll have to understand what is the monster that we created, just in the same way that in 1999 were the moment that the World Wide Web was already up and running, and we could just reflect on it and start analyzing it as a system, right? And understand what is that we created, and we realized we created something that we never intended. These very heterogeneous networks, and I think that reckoning is still waiting for us to kind of, as we're gonna go back and start looking at how the intelligence emerges from the AI systems.
Yeah. One of the former guests on the podcast has been Vint Cerf. And this is exactly the discussion we had about how some of the things were intended, but a lot wasn't. And so to some degree, this came as a surprise. I was actually doing research just this morning on the evolution of technology and combination of past technologies and trying to, look at that from a network perspective.
It's an incredible technology. It's something that if it wasn't there, we should have invented it, or maybe much longer time ago. And I am not scared of it, right? Every single generation has its own scary things, from social media to TV. You go back in time. My favorite one is actually the train. That in Britain, when the trains first emerged, we thought that's going to induce psychosis. So we're always afraid of the technology that is just emerging because we don't know it, and we fear that it's going to control us, or us controlling it. I think we have to do our homework as humans to say, how is it empowering us, and what does it teach us about humanity, and what's left for us in that context when a computer can do many, many things much better than we can.
Yeah, there is a great website called Pessimist Archive. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but it basically documents in the press all the fears we had about jazz music and the radio and the train and the bicycle that would enable girls. Can you imagine that, to go to a different village? But so you talked about fear, and it's a perfect segue to part 3 of the discussion. Not that I want to talk about fears, but I want to talk about human emotions and art. Now, the Barabasi lab has turned 25 years old, and what you've done is that you've actually translated research into data sculptures and visual works. I wonder if there is anything that you learned in the process of doing that. And you indeed even mentioned that the very first issue that you identified when it comes to communication, you improved over time, and originally you did not communicate the idea well enough. Is there something you learned from that process of creating or of translating your academic work into art that now is helping you when it comes to communication?
So Before I was studying to become a scientist, I was studying to become an artist, a sculptor to be more precise. And that was back in Romania, Transylvania. But I then, this was in high school, and I was taking the formal art classes in a special school to become one. And but then it turned out that during communism there was no path towards art school. I would have had to kind of try about 10 years in a row to get admitted. If I got admitted, art was very de-emphasized, so I took the easy way out and went to nuclear physics. But I kind of, when I became a professor at a relatively young age, I took advantage of the American system's offering that you're a professor, you can take classes freely at the university. So just at the time when we were developing network science and were making those discoveries that we spoke about earlier, I was spending part of my time in the art classes, learning everything from photography to history of art and so on. And I started to bring those tools and the way of thinking back to my lab. And what people perceived for a long time is there were what you call network visualizations. Yes, during those kind of 25 years, we ended up developing in my lab the visual language of networks. Many of the networks diagrams that you see today are the roots and the elementary steps towards that somehow were rooted, many of them actually, in my lab's work, not because we had a particular vision, but we were having access to the first networks data set. So we were seeing the challenges that needed to be solved. And when you refer to the 25 years, we indeed had a very big retrospective exhibition at the Ludwig Museum in Budapest and then Zetkheim in Germany and other places that kind of surveyed these 25 years. And the way I think about this really is, we talked about the fact that my primary work is still in science. We didn't talk about the fact that I also write for a general audience. I've written several books. And the way I think about it is that art, writing, and science are part of the exactly same creative process. We are learning to understand the world around us, to decipher its secrets. But the way I communicate the findings of that process, of the journey, it really comes in three different mediums. One medium is the research papers, which are very, very technical, deeply mathematical, and they're intended for a particular type of audience who really likes that. Another medium that I use is really general audience writing. Burst, Link, the formula are examples for that, right? And the third medium is art, visual arts, right? And what's the differences between these mediums? Well, no medium is complete, right? There is certain things I can write in the technical papers, but other things don't fit in there because they have a very strict format. So like I cannot talk about the implications, the societal impact, the future of that work in the research paper because the format is very constrained. That comes into my general writing. And then most important, both the general audience writing as well as the scientific writing lacks emotions. That is less emotional impact. So that's what we get actually through the visual artwork. So I really look at it as I'm sitting on a stool with three legs. As you know, as a physicist, three legs already gives you stability, right? And these three legs are the three different mediums through which I can communicate the same type of ideas that I'm always preoccupied with, because whatever I do in research papers, I actually do that in my general writing and I do that in my art. I'm not going to start painting sunsets, right? That everything that we do in the art is deeply connected to the science that we do and to the database journey that we do.
Is there a specific order? So do you always work first on the scientific part of it, then translate it? Or have you also started with doing a sculpture that you end up translating into the academic?
The science is primary. So the questions we ask is typically comes from the research lab. But some of the scientific journey is motivated by art, right? And for example, I told you that I wanted to become a sculptor, but much of the work that we did over 25 years was really in two dimensions, mostly in screens, right? So around 2007, I first started to kind of work on how do we bring this one out of 2D and turn it into 3D. Then I failed at it. And then finally, around 2017, I ended up turning that very question, that is, how do I do three-dimensional network sculpture, into a mathematical problem. And I brought it back to my lab as a scientific challenge. And the result of that was a 2018 Nature paper in which we introduced the concept of physical networks. And effectively, in my language, would be how do you create a three-dimensional sculptures where the links don't cross each other, right? Turned out to be a very difficult mathematical and algorithmic problem. Difficult enough that the result was worth a Nature paper, right? And then that's the tool set now we use to kind of create sculptures. So we have had several projects in my research lab that were motivated by art, but then we turn into database papers. So this was, for example, the Nature paper on the cover of the data sculptures, but also the same year we had a major paper in Science looking at trajectory of artists and how the network effects determine the success of an artist. And and even this year, actually earlier, we had the Nature paper on the cover of Nature that was also motivated by these physical network problems of how do we do surface minimization in these sculptures and how does nature do it. And the end product was a really beautiful sculpture that was on the cover of Nature.
You just said this was very beautiful. How do you deal with the fact that this may actually be a beautiful network, and yet you are not there yet when it comes to positioning yourself in saying, well, there are casual stories behind the network, right? So how do you resist the temptation of, because something is beautiful, making it into science and vice versa?
It's time. So I try to be never in a hurry. And what I mean by that is that, you remember I told you that I started working in 1994 on networks, and the first impactful publication came in 1999, 5 years later. I also mentioned that it was 2007 that I first started to work actually on 3D networks, and the publication was 2018, right? So what does time give you is the ability to keep thinking about the problem and finding the right avenues and finding the path towards the highest impact. And I always tell my lab, there's a misconception that researchers' role is to produce papers. No, our role is to produce discoveries. The paper is a vehicle to describe the discovery. So let's not focus on papers. Let's focus on discoveries. Hence, we are a low productivity but high impact lab.
Yeah. So again, about the interconnection between the two. So you've also mapped ballet dancer careers and architecture networks. So this is you here using scientific tools directly into what people will perceive as being very artistic, and for being very into those two things, I would say they are. So is there any universal patterns in how you find that artists, scientists such as yourself conduct their career? Is there something that you've learned when it comes to the evolution of those allegedly separate fields?
Oh, yes. And that journey led to the book, The Formula, where I try to kind of condense the rules and the fundamental patterns that we learn about careers, both in science and in art. And the claim of that book is really fundamentally that performance is something that you do, but success or acknowledgement of that is something that the community gives to you. And so I kind of use lots of examples coming from different fields to illustrate what are the patterns that define the success, which is the community acknowledgement, whether you are in science, whether you are in art, whether you are in music. And the point of the book is really that there are different patterns and laws applied depending on where you. Different laws define individual success, but the totally different mechanisms work when you work in a groups, right? Or when you're looking for short-term or long-term impact and so on. So depending on where you are with your career, what are your goals, different mechanisms matter. If you are a very performance-driven field, like running or sports, performance uniquely determines your success. However, if you are in art, where performance is unmeasurable, because we cannot really objectively distinguish works from each other, then what matters is the network. Which network matters? That's the key, right? And that's what the formula is about, is that How do you identify the network that really drives your artistic career? How do you engage with that? How do you not waste time on other things and purely doing networking, but focus on things that matter? And how do these networks fundamentally work, that you are part of it? Because if you are not acknowledging that, you're going blindly forward with your career.
Yeah, I don't know if you took running as a random example, but I happen to be a lot into it. And I do find actually that even in a race, you end up achieving the best performance, maybe because there is a network, right? And it's not as if I were to compete with the person next to me. I really don't care. And in fact, I want the person to do very well because I'm not, one of the top 10 runners in the race. So it seems that even there, maybe there is a network. And I'm very happy you are mentioning the formula because I had so many questions about it, and asking about ballet dancer careers was a way for me to try to plug in those questions about performance, which is bounded, and success, which you explain is unbounded, and the laws of success. So something for the listeners. Let me conclude with a very final question, which is potentially the hardest one. What is the most important open question in network science that remains simple to state but hard to solve?
Where do networks come from?
And are you trying to get to an answer, or is it out of reach?
For several years on that, and obviously I don't have an answer because you asked me something to give you a question that doesn't have a clear answer.
No, indeed. Okay. So that is one of the main drivers for you to wake up every day and
one of them. And I was working even today on that problem.
Do you think it's just an intuition here that the bulk of the answer will come from science, or maybe it's art?
My take on that is that it's going to be through writing, because it's not one of those questions that you find a formula for, but you need to, it's ridden with uncertainties and ridden with speculation as well. So my take on that is actually through the third leg of my stool, which is really writing.
Yeah, as a discovery process for ideas to emerge.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so very much again. Wonderful discussion. Your work is very inspiring and highly relevant to a lot of what I do and to what our listeners are doing. So thank you very much for your time. I much appreciate it. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.